Right now, we are still pressuring Vice President Harris and the Democratic Party to adopt the demands of our movement that speak to the grief and frustration of anti-war voters that want a policy shift that ends the killing and occupation of Palestinians. And we haven't heard that yet. And so we will continue pressuring Vice President Harris, the Democratic Party, and the Biden administration to end the killing of Palestinians and occupation and siege of Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank.
What must happen until November?
I'm sorry?
What must happen until November so you would recommend voting for Harris?
I'm sorry, I don't understand.
What should happen until November?
I mean, we will continue pressuring, and we need to hear from Vice President Harris how she will shift course from the current Biden administration and how she's going to differentiate herself from Donald Trump.
What do you expect?
I'm not sure.
Hello, folks. Oops. Welcome back to Left Reckoning 181. That was
82.
182. That was uncommitted lead Layla Alabed talking with Dropsite News, which people should follow. Dropsite News, along with Zateo, one of the new sort of promising media ventures. But talking about the state of things, I think sums it up. Don't know what's going to happen. That's something like, I would say I am pessimistic. I think she can't afford that pessimism in her position as, trying to actually move these things. This indications don't look super great. But that's where we are after on night 2 of the Democratic National Convention.
And also at this point too, like the push has to be on an arms embargo. I mean, having a vague backing of a quote unquote ceasefire has been kind of like the non-committed position of the Democratic Party for a while now. What we need is to stop funding and aiding Israel as it slaughters, unimaginable amounts of women and children and civilians in Gaza.
Yeah. And, how this seems to be playing out is, Harris is clear, no embargo entirely, because Israel needs to defend itself from all these mean people in the region that want to do a war against it for some who knows reason. Maybe it's that they keep carrying out assassinations and missile strikes on other people's territory. Who knows if context like that could ever be inserted into a discussion like this for the American public that's funding it. But yeah, it's depressing stuff.
Yes, very much so. And we're going to be talking a little bit more. We'll be talking a lot about the convention today. In just a minute, we'll be joined by our good friend, Elias Cepeda, to talk about some of the on-the-ground organizing and protest movements in Chicago outside of the Democratic National Convention. And after that, Matt and I are going to talk a little bit more in depth about, where our movement is and some of our reaction to what we've been seeing from the DNC. But before we get to that, it's good to be back with you, Matt. Good to be back hanging out with everybody.
Welcome back from Colorado, David.
Yeah, I had a very nice time. Appreciate you holding down the fort last week. I also really enjoyed both the main show and your bonus episode that you put out. That was really great. And to get access to that, you can go to
patreon.com/Left Reckoning. Yeah, Olivia Jutel. Look, folks, I can't get enough of the crypto venture capitalist. I'm really obsessed with that. I've been obsessed with that since the TMBS days. Mm-hmm. And Olivia had a good piece that sort of brings together seasteading, the libertarian sort of going Galt fantasy of, we don't need this society that caters to all of my whims and signs contracts with my surveillance companies. Don't need them anymore.
Yeah, how is the seasteading going? Do you know?
I think it's still in beta.
It's still in the idea phase.
Yeah, we're in the idea standpoint.
But no, seriously, folks, check out that episode. You can get access to that. Patreon.com/Left Reckoning. And also access to the post game where after Matt and I talk a little bit with Elias and a couple other things during the main show, we're going to be looking at Russell Brand, another subject that Matt just it keeps on saying will be the last one, but he keeps getting reeled back in, which is why he's a great entertainer.
I genuinely couldn't have foreseen the sort of anger I would have towards the guy. I've been into it. I've listened to I probably listened to Russell Brand audio more than any other content in my life. And to see the it's a turn that was foreseeable, especially knowing where it's gone now, but to see how far he's gone with it and to attack Palestine protesters over wearing masks and among other things, the one thing that's consistent that you'll see is he will judge you for what you eat. And so that comes out too. So yeah, patreon.com/left reckoning for us to dig into a Russell Brand some more.
Yeah. Well, before we get to all that, I wanted to talk a little bit, give folks a little bit of analysis of, I think, a fairly important story. As people know, on this program, we have been very, very excited about what's been going on in the UAW, both with their strike and their fight against the big three auto companies, along with the, honestly, frankly, incredible work they've been doing organizing grad student workers across the country as well. But also how the UAW has done something that we think is extremely necessary, which is connecting the labor fight in this country to the international struggle for justice and for peace. And one of the hallmarks of that has been the strength and the tenacity with which the UAW has been standing with the people of Palestine. And I want to talk about a kind of weird level of interference that we've been seeing. And there's been reporting on this for a little while, but we want to make sure that we're bringing it to y'all's attention because it's very alarming and very odd. As people probably know, and we don't have time to get into all of this history here, but the UAW has had, let's say, some issues in the past. And as part of that, a judge back in 2021 put in a federal monitor to make sure that the UAW was acting in the best interest of its members. That also pushed for there to be a direct election of the president, which is how Sean Fain became the leader of the UAW. Now, there's been a lot of weird things going on with this monitor, though, and I think most notably, and I think the one that's most pertinent to this conversation today is what has been going on regarding Gaza. So, see if I can get this up here. So there's been good reporting on this by Ryan Grimm at Dropsite as well that you should be checking out. But this was a piece put out a couple weeks back in these Times magazine by Annie Levine and Sanjukta Paul called "Why is the UAW's federal monitor involving himself in the union's stance on Gaza?" Because this is, frankly, a massive overreach of the federal monitor. So the federal monitor is there to basically make sure that there's no grift, there's no corruption, there's not a kind of top-down authoritarian system going on within the UAW. And yet, while that you'd think that keep somebody busy, a lot of things to sort of keep tabs on, making sure there's nothing foul play happening. They've been very interested in one particular thing, which has been the UAW's stance against the genocide in Gaza. First, let's just go over a quick timeline here. In December, you first see these calls from the UAW calling for a ceasefire. And Matt, I mean, you remember that when that happened, that was something that I think, we always held out hope, but I think both of us are fairly surprised to see them coming out so strongly about that.
Yeah, and Sean Fain, also Brandon Mancia, beneath Fain, but a bunch of UAW organizers came through on that in a way that is distinctive for labor history. Like often, in the 70s, labor would be, say, on the issue of Vietnam, at least split. And so, it's great to see such a stance. They balanced it out by endorsing Joe, who was doing, the genocide alongside Israel afterwards. That's politics, as we see with Sean O'Brien. Unions have a difficult task in not being shred by the two-party electoral system. But yeah.
No. I mean, I think very much fair enough, but something that's extremely unfair and wrong has been what this federal monitor has been doing. So
Absolutely.
the Detroit News reported that and this is from the Ryan Grimm's reporting. This is also in these times and from the Detroit News, that once this call for a ceasefire came out, the Federal Monitor called Sean Fain in to have a conversation on a quote strictly personal level about Gaza, which right there we're already in a lot of trouble. There's no personal
On
level
no subject.
conversations on no
Yeah.
subject,
Yeah.
let alone something like this. So already we're
Like
getting
it, yeah, if you want advice on toothpaste, I'm like, talk to somebody who cares. Like this, we have there's one thing we should be discussing, and that's the issues that the Fed monitor was put in place for, which is not whether our members decide they want to call for a ceasefire in Gaza. It is one of the most absurdly menacing things that has happened in American politics over the course of this, assault on Gaza.
No, totally. And then to add to this, in February, and the Monitor again, like when they made this call to Sean Fain, they knew, for example, that one, they had no direct mandate to be having conversations on international policy of the United Auto Workers Union. But they also knew that it was also probably inappropriate for them to be having that conversation, which is why they try to cordon it off and say, oh, this is a strictly personal conversation, which again, you should have no influence over the way that the United Auto Workers Union is operating its international policy, right? That is not your role to be trying to put a counterweight to the membership and the leadership of that kind of organization on those questions. It's completely absurd. And it's not, I'm sorry, you just can't have a conversation like this without noting that it's not as if the Monitor doesn't know this, doesn't know that these kind of implications, that they're unhappy with the way that leadership, in this case Sean Fain, is conducting themselves, has a little bit of an implication to it, since this same Monitor is the one who has tremendous authority and discretion to make life extremely difficult, for somebody like Sean Fain. Just to add to this really quick before we talk about it more holistically, Matt. In February, the Monitor also noted their dissatisfaction with the activities of the union when the Monitor emailed a letter from the Anti-Defamation League, which, Matt, if you want to remind our audience here about that organization.
I mean, I think there can't be enough said negatively about the basically, disgrace that the Anti-Defamation League represents, which is supposed to guard against anti-Semitism, but which is in practice outlawed any sort of pro-Palestine sentiment. There's a Phil Donahue who recently died. Interview with Edward Said and an Anti-Defamation League representative on there. I'd recommend going to look at that if you want to see the role that the ADL has played right up to, whitewashing Elon Musk and his role as owner of Twitter. Like basically saying Edward Said's might have a bomb underneath his
Jesus
vest
Christ, yeah.
at the moment, like the worst kind of insinuations. So yeah, the ADL also, like, I mean, really unhelpful, because there is issues with anti-Semitism, and when, like, say,
Mhm.
Nick Fuentes type shit gets into the bloodstream, say through Kanye West, it's not helpful. It's not helpful to have an organization which is actually here to defend Zionism, being the one who's trying to say, coach Kyrie Irving about what documentaries to watch on Amazon Prime. Like it's a really bad organization. I'm not afraid to say so, because people have been too afraid to, and not in these corners. Like, I mean, I've taken cues from Michael Brooks and Sam about that, but to see the way that they've smeared people that are just trying to speak up for Palestine through the years, it's really gross. So yeah.
100%. And in this case, has been reported by Ryan Grimm at Dropsite, and in these Times piece, the Federal Monitor emailed a letter from the Anti-Defamation League to the UAW's legal department. And in this note, again, made the point to say that they understand that this is outside of their jurisdiction, but they also claimed, quote, this is from the Indies Times piece, that this matter was serious. Again, so if you're in a position where you're getting messages from somebody who is in an authority position over you, and they note something as, quote, serious, what is the implication? I mean, what are you supposed to do when somebody notes that, something serious? Well, you're supposed to take heed, and maybe change your actions or your activities, to some extent, right? So this is very clear, a kind of pressure that is coming from the Federal Monitor on the UAW, a union that has created a lot of enemies for itself. As one, it has taken on some of the wealthiest and most powerful corporations in the American economy, right? Along with now taking on some of the most entrenched political forces in the American political system, which is the pro-apartheid lobby in the United States. So it is absolutely inappropriate for a Federal Monitor to be acting in this way. And there is precedent for something like this. I think that is absolutely would be the correct course of action for the Federal Monitor to be removed from this position, because they've clearly shown that they are not responsible enough to sit in this role, because they're very willing to utilize their position to put forward whatever kind of personal political agenda that they have, as is evidenced by these extremely inappropriate conduct that we probably are only seeing a short, a small snippet of. This is just what has sort of been brought out to the public here.
Yeah. I'm just looking at, in 2000, Edward Said went to South Lebanon on a solidarity tour where he hurled a rock toward an Israeli guardhouse from the Lebanese border, which he described as a symbolic gesture of joy to mark the end of the Israeli occupation of southern Lebanon. A photographer caught the action, featuring Said with his arm reached far behind him, ready to throw. The Israeli lobby, led by the ADL, called on Colombia to punish Said. Colombia refused to be intimidated, though it took the administration 2 months of eerie silence to respond. I think we can call that foreshadowing to how they've responded since. But yeah, that's the type of role that the ADL plays. Israel can occupy whoever the fuck, and the people celebrating the removal of that occupation or resistance to that occupation, anti-Semites.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's it's an organization that has lost tremendous amounts of credibility by what it's willing to ignore and cover up. So, anyways, I think that this is a very important note to keep in y'all's in y'all's heads about what's going on behind the scenes with the UAW. Why the continuation, why Sean Fain's and the UAW's commitment to justice, both for American workers and for people all across the globe, is so important, and all of the kind of pressure that they're under from certain forces in the political class, to certainly the bosses and the wealthy and the billionaires in this country, to even the Federal Monitor here, who has very clearly stepped outside of their mandate, and I think should be removed.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, folks, we're going to jump over to our on-the-ground report with Elias Cepeda to talk about Chicago and what's going on the ground outside of the DNC. When we get back, Matt and I are going to give you all a little taste of our perspective on what we've seen so far and what we think is going to be coming over the next few days. So you won't want to miss any of that. Don't forget to join us in the postgame, patreon.com/leftreckoning. But without further ado, here's our conversation with Elias.
Welcome back, Left Reckoners. I'm Matt Leck. With me, as ever, David Griscom. Hello, David.
Hey, brother.
And join us once again, Elias Cepeda. Elias is a writer, teacher, fight coach, who we recently had on to talk about Imani Khalif at the Olympics. But we thought we'd have him back because the DNC is in his neck of the woods. And he shared with me a Instagram post from National Lawyers Guild Chicago. And I'll just put this up right here to kind of frame the discussion. But I mean, none of this is very surprising, what we've seen ahead of this convention here. I think it may be historically precedented might be a better way to put it, but National Lawyers Guild has this. It says the DNC begins with massive shows of police force aggressive response to protesters. Elias, you've been out there. Who have you been out there with, and what have you seen?
Yeah, thanks for having me on. Came back home this weekend, Sunday. I was actually helping out with some security at basically a counter convention, something called the People's Assembly. It had some third-party candidates. It had Jill Stein speaking at it. It had Claudia de la Cruz at it. And it was at the Rainbow Push Coalition headquarters in Kenwood in the south side, near south side of Chicago. So I was there for a bit. It wasn't, its existence is kind of a protest in of itself, but it wasn't a march anywhere. We were there, and things went well. All the attendees seemed to have a good time. Everyone was safe. No real issues there. The candidates were made it in, made it out, and all that. And then they went on to some of them went on. It appeared. I think Claudia de la Cruz went to a march on Michigan Avenue, a main mostly commercial corridor and part of Chicago's downtown neighborhood. Later that evening, I was a bit tired. I was doing their security for about 8 hours along with the team, the Healthy Hood Chicago team. So I wasn't at that. But the next day, we went to a fairly large park called Union Park in Chicago's near west side. And post World War II, it was part of what was described as what became to be what the genesis of neighborhood genesis of the term Skid Row. It's since become one of the richest zip codes in all of the country. After Oprah Winfrey opened her studios there, Michael Jordan would play some games there. And so it's an interesting neighborhood, and it's just east of the United Center where the convention is being held, the Democratic National Convention. So there was a march on DNC 2024, which is a group of organizers, formed a coalition of different groups. I wasn't a part of the organizing or anything like that. I was just, staying abreast of what they were doing. And they said, we're going to be marching on first day of the convention and the last. So that's Monday and then this coming Thursday. They've been fighting for over half a year to get a permit from the city of Chicago to be able to march within quote unquote sight and sound of the actual arena to try to make, an impact and actually be a demonstration. And my understanding was they got a permit that would end at this street called Ashland, a westward boundary Ashland, which is about a mile away about a mile away, like 4 city blocks, but in actuality about a mile away from the stadium on Damon. And we started the march there, and we went west, and there was a big police presence. I was there with some contingent from our nonprofit organization, Pilsen Defense and Access of the Pilsen neighborhood, and we were there just as wanted to be a part of the mass of people. The organizers said about 15,000 people were there. I don't know if that's true or not. I haven't seen any media reports counter that. It's clear there were thousands and thousands of people. But the aerial footage that's come out looks pretty solid. And we were there just on our own, but also to help with some security for on this issue, and I think other issues that could be argued. Probably not that this is a high bar, but I think he deserves credit for it. The best elected official in the entire state of Illinois on issue of Palestinian liberation. That's Byron Ciccio Lopez. And because we had his back there, and they asked him to be at the very front of the march holding a banner, we were at the very front of the march. There was 2 hours of programming. People like Dr. Cornel West spoke there. A lot of, not famous, but really amazing organizers and people, students, elders were speaking for a couple hours. And then at 3:00, so 3 hours later, we got on Washington Boulevard behind the banner and started marching, surrounded by police the entire time. And there in the park, there were a lot of counter protesters. But the counter protesters, for the most part, at least at the front, didn't seem to follow us. The police certainly did, though.
The Chicago element to this is so interesting to me. Not only the 1968 sort of echo, which is there's massive protesting the Democrats because of Vietnam. I mean, not along with Gaza right now, one of the times in American history where the galloping military-industrial evil was just like going. And also Chicago, I believe the largest Palestinian population itself. Not that you need to be Palestinian to care about this, but I'm curious just about Chicago. What would you speak to the city itself meeting this?
Yeah, I think that's a really great point. I think that's underappreciated and underrecognized for bad reasons, and sometimes for understandably good reasons. Like you have the uncommitted movement in places like Michigan, which has a really large Arab and Palestinian and broadly speaking Middle Eastern descent population. But yeah, my understanding is the Chicago metropolitan area has the largest Palestinian population in the country, or one of. And one of our board members is Palestinian and Lebanese, Rami Daoud, who's a great activist, much more experience as a protester than I. He also does a lot of trainings for people, but also specifically for protesters. Some of them out in the open that we raise funds for people in Gaza for, and others are kind of secret. And he's told me that there's a number of areas of Illinois that have really, really large concentrations of Palestinian folks. And we had people at the front and all around. The first people we actually saw when we got to Union Park was a group of people from our neighborhood in Pilsen that I didn't know, the alderman knew, and then I met them. They had a sign that said "Latinos por Palestina," and I asked him later. I said, "Oh, do they have like an organization?" And he's like, "No, they're just Mexicans that made the sign, and they've been showing up to the protest in solidarity." I think a lot of people see, a lot of colonized people, we see ourselves in Palestine as well as in other places, and I think although there's a lot of really awful, to use maybe a little bit of useful, but maybe a sanitized, term, humanitarian disasters throughout the world. The United States certainly has a very direct hand in this one, and so it's finally getting a bit more attention. But it was a diverse group. There were, I think that's a reflection of the great organizing that the people that put together this march did. They represent a lot of different organizations, a lot of different communities, and all over the country too. I mean, the reality is, from my understanding, I was at one of their meetings they had in a union building here in part, not far away in a part of the Chicago. It's called Union City because historically that's where a lot of the locals have built their headquarters and stuff. I think we're in the Teamsters building. They had been planning to march on this convention for years, because even before this latest part of ethnic cleansing and genocide in Palestine by Israel and the United States, there were plenty of reasons to protest the Democratic Party, right? And they had been planning, and they absolutely did march in Milwaukee. I wasn't there in Milwaukee where the Republicans had their national convention, but yeah, they've been planning this for a while, and it is a multi-interest, multi-noted protest, right? They're protesting the ethnic concentration camps we have within our borders for Latin people who are fleeing the results of the United States is interventions and coup attempts and starvation of their nations, places like Venezuela and South America, and plenty of places in Central America, and they're protesting police violence, and then they protesting this latest part of the genocide, what can truthfully be said by, if you just look at the numbers for the period of time, what is certainly seems to be a Holocaust of indigenous people by America and Israel. That's definitely become a focal point, but they've been organizing for a while. So there's a lot of different folks. We had, I had right to my right at the front, we had some anti-Zionist Orthodox Jewish homies were there. And, that's usually a very visible in Palestine and elsewhere. That's a very visible contingent of people that oppose Zionism. They've got their own reasons for doing it, and it's an interesting, sometimes problematic reason for doing it, but they are certainly standing arm in arm with a bunch of people from different places with different interests and representing different coalitions that were not afraid to put Palestine at the front of this, and also we're smart enough to realize that it's connected to all the other issues we see of capitalism and empire.
The Latinas for Palestina, that's such Latinos for Palestina, that's such an interesting, I mean, that's the raw material for a movement, right? And like, I guess like it's good to see that come into, out, because a healthy society should be producing that sort of thing. And I guess the challenge is like, how do we sustain this sort of natural organizing into something that can actually, grab power in ways. So yeah, I mean, that's very interesting detail.
Yeah, no, I agree, and I don't have the answer, but it's good to see just this develop organically with not a lot of if any, real support from any mainstream avenues. That these organizers and activists individually have faced a lot of issues. It's not necessarily. We're not in a situation where, as we read it, we understand it to have been in 1968, where then Mayor Richard J. Daley, who he was mayor for decades, and then his son, a couple decades later, served for decades, served in quotation marks, where he promised, he said, hey, in the face of people like students for the SDS, like people like Bill Ayers and stuff before he went underground, and his friends having the goal of saying, we want to get 1 million people to Chicago. Mayor Daley at that time, who was also, more importantly than being the mayor, he was the head of the Illinois Democratic Party. And this is the Illinois Democratic Party that delivered the presidency to John F. Kennedy. And so these are major players in the country and in the world politically, for better off and for worse. He promised, he said, you're going to be put in jail and you're going to be hurt specifically. And the rhetoric has not been that from our current mayor, who likes to style himself as an activist and some type of maybe socialist, depending on the day or something. I don't know, but still has, he went back before he was even elected. Once it seemed like he had a chance, he went back in his campaign, vague promises to undercut funding to the murder Chicago Police Department. He said, actually, I won't cut them the budget by one dime, was his quote. He went back on his support for Palestinian people and said, you know what, I'm actually, I support Israel's existence and stuff like that. He hasn't been promising violence, but he's been upping the budget of the police force. The police force, which hates him as well. A police force which has been training specifically to riot. I don't know what else to call it when they have riot gear. They're the only people around that had riot gear, right? None of us came with gear, allowed to, ready to riot. So the people that are prepared for riots are the ones I'm assuming are ready to riot. So they didn't have that type of rhetoric, but we knew that the police budget is going to have it. We see him, the mayor, welcome warmly Joe Biden, and so we know that they're against us. We see the Chicago police beating students on Michigan Avenue at the Art Institute. We see them, beat up students and try to break up, and eventually did break up encampments at DePaul University on the north side of Chicago. We see, just north of Chicago, Northwestern, them attack encampments too. So we see they're ready. And then also kind of like soft things happening, like when President Biden was still going to be the presumptive nominee, they decided, hey, we're not going to actually have him accept the nomination in Chicago. We're going to do a Zoom thing. I think that was meant to depress, turnout. I knew friends from different parts of the country when that was announced. They're saying, well, you know what? I don't know if I'm going to go. Not because they're not committed, but because coming to Chicago for them is hard. It's easy for me. I'm from here. They have to try to take off work and risk getting fired and, take a train or a caravan or flights. It's a lot of stuff. So, that level of, I think that was meant to depress turnout. Basically the city has been saying over and over, if you get within, if you get past the distance where you can't even see the stadium in Ashland and Washington, you can't see the stadium. It's, you're going to have a concert, outdoor concert venue. You can move Lollapalooza to Union Park and you wouldn't really be able to hear it there. They're saying if you go past this area, you are in violation of the police orders. And when people violate police orders, it's kind of carte blanche historically just to be beaten. So they faced on a lot of that. They still showed up. I think probably, I'm assuming they wanted more people, but it was a really good show of force, I thought, still. And they faced on a lot. I mean, when we were there, I'm sitting there with a member of the city council who is an ally with the mayor publicly. I'm not trying to, I think that's fair. I think they present themselves as allies. And I'm asking him, what's the deal? Did they get the permit to go further? And he's like, no. So I was like, okay, so we'll be in violation of police orders immediately, like our first step. He's like, yes. So what's the plan? He's like, well, the informal agreement is they'll probably let us get to Damon, but then they're gonna, if we want to go further or if we want to turn back in the route we want to, we'll have to negotiate, and the police don't usually like to negotiate past what's on paper. And so there's a lot of uncertainty, a lot of fear, and I credit him for still being willing to go out there and be there, and I credit everyone else, because everyone else is unprotected, but at the same token, an elected official puts himself in a crowd. There's no real protection for them. He doesn't have a police detail. He didn't even have his staff around him. I don't work for him. Our people don't work for him, but we're in the community, and we were just the security, right? So that's a very it's a very scary thing. So it's been very impressive to see all these folks. I'm just kind of jumping on on their tailcoats and stuff and trying to ride along and just be a part of the crowd. But they've really organized past a lot of repressive things subtly. Things that are subtly meant to dampen, even they wanted, there was, let's say there were 10,000. I don't know if there were 15, but let's say there were 10,000 people in this park starting out the march. The organizers had great water set up and blah, 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 and snacks for people, which is really impressive. But they all and made space for people to have their booths and do the literature and stuff like that before marching, and had a great stage and good audio. But they also said, hey, we have a budget for 50 porta potties, right? The city only gave 7. I only saw 6. And so what happened is there's a 2-hour line to have to go into a porta potty. And I think that is a way to discourage people from staying to march or coming. Some people are coming from all over. Some people have, different needs. There were people ahead of me in the march that were elderly and in wheelchairs, They face a lot. They face a lot of outright repression or the specter of getting beaten, and a lot of other things that could dampen it. So it was impressive to see them move forward. At the front of it, I think there was no real. The police were relatively physical in that they tried to cut off literally the width of our banner by having their bike patrol there to push us in. So they were physical in that regard. This police force, which publicly and privately fought to not have to wear masks and had incredibly high COVID infection rates all throughout the pandemic. A lot of them off the bat, they just had their faces completely covered in the summer heat because they want to be secret police, right? So they had ski masks on and stuff like that. At the same time, we're being told, not as explicitly as people in New York City, but hey, masks are kind of shady. That's a sign of you being shady, right? You shouldn't be doing that, right? So there was a lot of that going on. There was some counter-pressure off the bat that had different agendas, some pro-Israel government folks, but up front there wasn't a lot of people giving into temptation of the police or goading them or getting distracted, but. The night before, the one on Michigan Avenue, people were arrested there. A couple people were arrested. And then that protest itself, somewhere else, police arrested, I think, a dozen more. And a couple of them needed hospitalization, according to the National Guild of Lawyers, who had legal observers there. And they've been really great. They have a hotline for the DNC protests, and they had you can call them up if you're doing a smaller action. You can call them up and say, I'd like legal observers. So they were keeping a really good eye on it. We had a lot of international press there, some local press there. So there's definitely a lot of violence. And then today, the Chicago police superintendent came out and said, we could have been and should have maybe been more violent than we were. So there's more protests to come. There's a protest being organized at the so-called Israeli embassy today. We're canceling our Muay Thai class to allow people to go, and after Jiu-Jitsu tonight to go to that. We're doing the same on Thursday. There's another March on DNC protest at 5 o'clock there. So there's definitely some violence. Thankfully, it hasn't approached, not that it matters to the people that got beat up, it hasn't approached the levels of like 1968 yet, and that's really good.
Yeah, well, I mean, stay safe, because if we might have all forgotten that there was an attempt on Donald Trump's life several weeks ago, but people who haven't is cops who want to brutalize people and their apologists, because the second that these protests get too far for them, they'll be like, well, we have to protect people's lives. This is a dangerous country, so that's why we had to beat the shit out of all these people.
That's exactly
so, yeah.
right. That was one of my biggest concerns going in, and the police union here is led by not just a MAGA guy, he is, but also literally a QAnon follower who is not legally allowed to carry a gun because of domestic charges on his place. So it's a very I don't know what people think about Chicago outside of here, but it's an incredibly reactionary city. The people itself are very diverse and stuff, but like, to the extent that, it's a Democrat city, it's a non-ideological type of Democrat that has always lived here, at least in the seats of power. They've differentiated themselves from Republicans only in like nods towards gun control, or historically not hating unions, although there's been huge privatization efforts here, especially through the charter schools as well. So all that is to say, being a Democrat here really is no indication of being left-leaning, and the police are not Democrats. they're extremely reactionary, and I have to just real quick towards you mentioned like they're apologists or courtiers by another word. I forgot the word you used, but I was really glad to see literally hundreds of press, presumably a lot of independent ones, but if you look at the wire services were clearly there, grabbing footage, international press, even some local ones. And they were right in front of us, and they were surrounded by police as well. And they clearly, a lot of them knew what they were facing. They were ready. They had bike helmets on, and they were ready. As opposed to when we got to the end of our march, at least the destination, the first leg of it, there were security, so-called security fences put up. We're in a park. There's a church. There's a parking lot, another parking lot in the stadium. So we were definitely within sight and sound. So the organizers and all the protesters did a good job of making that happen, even though it was illegal, I guess. When we got there, there were the police, local police. There were clearly a lot of federal people, security personnel, and then they had embedded in Chicago. They had embedded media there with them, pointing their cameras from across the fence, right? So I'm really thankful for the media that, we're not hiding behind the NSA and Secret Service to take photos of the ne'er-do-wells, but that were there right with us and surrounded by cops who have disdain for them, as well as us. So I'm very appreciative of that. And it got serious there a little bit. Some people from the crowd, it was not part of the plan that was expressed to any of us, went and started taking apart the fence. I don't know, they had wrenches with them or something, and then jumped over. They clearly wanted to get arrested, and then they did get arrested, and those are probably the ones that got beat, because on our way back, we left at that point. On our way back, the police had like, I have some video of it, but they were probably like 300 police ready to be deployed. And then one paddy wagon, we call it paddy wagon. I don't know if that's used otherwise. It's a derivative. I guess it's a derisive term, but it's paddy referring to Irish people. So I don't know if it referred to the police that were the only ones allowed to be police. The Irish people were only allowed to be police for a while, or to fill it with Irish people. In any case, they probably had room for like 20 prisoners, but they had like 300 cops ready to deploy as well. So it got a little hairy there, and I think that's probably where the arrests happened and the some of the brutalization happened. But again, even there is a little bit scary for people, because some of the harassment that happened in Union Park was because all of a sudden, out of nowhere, because you have the law, you have what you're allowed to, you have statutory stuff that's typically allowed, and sets the tone. You have, of course, higher constitutional principles. But in any case, you can usually the city has been allowing the people that we failed to like unhoused people to like pitch tents in parks and stuff like that, usually close at 11. But all of a sudden, a tent is contraband, or pitching a tent now is something you can be arrested for. We get to the park where we ended up, in a different park, and the city had put up signs saying, contraband included a laptop. So all of a sudden, just about every media member, just by virtue of following us and wanting to be there, could be arrested for having a laptop. They could be arrested for having a tent and things of that nature. And, the fact that these may not be constitutional doesn't help you in the moment. So, again, I really appreciate all the. I wasn't there in my journalist capacity, so I really appreciate the journalists who were doing that, and all the really all the people that it was maybe a lot harder to be at that, and there were a lot more. From physical ailments to other stuff, it was maybe a lot more danger. I think I really have a lot of respect for them, and they're still out there. They did. People 5 o'clock went to Michigan Avenue after that. As well. So people, whatever their work hours are, people are finding ways to hit up different parts of the city to make their voices heard.
Right on. Well, Elias Cepeda, if people want to follow your journalistic work at Elias Cepeda on the Everything app, X, Twitter, and we'll have your link tree in the comments as well. Thanks so much for the update, man.
Thank you, guys. Appreciate you.
Good. Checking in with Elias again as the demon rats trample across Chicago.
Not to spoil the conversation we'll be having a little bit about Russell Brand, but one of the ways to tell that he might be a little bit of I don't know. I shouldn't cast aspersions, but it is interesting to notice that he keeps on saying the Democrat Party all the time now whenever he talks about them.
He literally, I think, corrects himself and then says I shouldn't have called them a Democratic. Call them a Democrat. So someone's gotten into his ear about that, actually.
That's actually really awesome. Well, yeah, you'll be able to get access to all that in the postgame patreon.com/leftreckoning. But before we get there, Matt, I have some notes I wanted to talk about sort of where we're at, because I think that certainly this democratic socialist movement that you and I have been a part of for so much of our adult life is in a kind of weird moment, and I have a larger kind of point, more holistic about that. But before we get there, I know you've talked about it a little bit, but do you have any kind of general thoughts on that first day of the Democratic National Convention?
Oh, general disgust at AOC for saying the thing about this tirelessly working for a ceasefire. It's hard for me to, comment on the things I would typically find welcome, like the Sean Fain. I like that guy. I like even a lot of what AOC and even Joe Biden, when he talks about some economic stuff, is fine.
Mm-hmm.
No, I don't have a whole lot to say besides, that I think saying that Kamala Harris is tirelessly working for a ceasefire is a lie about a genocide, which is a pretty dark place to end up from this.
Yeah, I think more than anything, it's a bit revealing to the kind of calculations that are going on from that section, because AOC
That's
was
true.
AOC was early, and people don't recognize this. Was early to call it a genocide and to start putting pressure, to the extent that they did. And I'm not saying that actually to whitewash it. I'm saying that to say that this is terrible. What we're seeing here is all right. So now you've done what you've needed to do to get a kind of prime time spot. You have your supposed comrades, members of the DSA, members of the left that you're supposed to be a representative outside of the convention, calling for an end to the genocide, calling for an end of the Democratic Party support for it. And you say something like Kamala Harris has been working tirelessly for a ceasefire, which is just an absolute bald-faced lie.
And look, and why was she there on night one?
Mm-hmm.
She was asked. She didn't ask. She was asked by the party to do it, because they're not unaware that there are going to be protests about that policy. And so her saying that is undermining those protests. And AOC on the genocide question, she was she wasn't as quick as Talib, who is, our queen around here. She originally played this game of it's a right for Ilhan and Rashida to say genocide if they want. It's their free speech. And then she came around to very plausibly committing genocide. Great. That's where she at least needs to be. There's a complete pantomime about ceasefire negotiations. And that's going on, whereas supposedly Hamas needs to accept, they just assassinated Hania, and the terms that Netanyahu was setting, I mean, they're insincere, and we all know this, and we've been through this over and over again. It's almost 11 months.
And I think, in specifically to how Israel has been conducting this genocide, it has always sort of relied on this, let's see how long we can extend the clock on this operation, right? Where, the left liberals are getting really upset about this. Let's let Joe Biden get a kind of soundbite or make it seem like he's speaking tough or bear hugging, as we got very early on. Netanyahu, and all that we get during this is just the continuation of the indefensible mass slaughter here. So, to play into this game where, actually deciding in this moment right now, in August, almost a year from when this mass slaughter campaign began, to say, right now might be the time to start pulling the pressure off a little bit and saying to the Biden administration, we're really happy with, how hard y'all have been working on this. It's pretty damning.
And Dawitz asked, so what are your guys' thoughts on the uncommitted people having a panel or something at DNC? I respect the uncommitted people. They did get their panel, and as we play at the top of the show, they remain uncommitted because it remains unclear what policy is going to change. Now, I've been hearing always that people are ready for a shift in tone, and that is simply not enough. If Biden's tone was better throughout this period, it would still be it would probably even be more insanity inducing that we are slaughtering people like crazy. We are bombing them up and down the goddamn coast, right? So this isn't a tone issue. I welcome word today that Blinken's going to be gone, because I think he belongs, in a pantheon of hell, but I don't trust that necessarily her guy is going to be. Frank, the problem is this, I genuinely believe that a non-Biden Democrat will be less vehemently Zionist. However, the point we are in history right now is an end game on Gaza. So it's not enough to just be better on Israel than Joe Biden. It's going to take something that it's going to take a lot of courage. And I see no indication of that at all, unfortunately. And it's not come from AOC. And the tough thing is, so we have to think, and Josh Kahn Russell used to walk us through how you actually push on this stuff. So the folks we talked to, about with Elias, pushed on the outside. If you look through the civil rights struggle, you need those people, because that's what makes those meetings that are agreed to, not out of good faith, but out of let's let some air out of the tires, because we need to do something for these people because we look bad. That's what makes those meetings have some meaning. The more people are pushing outside, the more the actual threat is, then the more those meetings will actually be given. And the problem is there's a disconnect happen. And AOC's the thing. I don't know what I think DNC has a lot of internal navel gazing to look at with this. But when AOC started making the pivot about we're going to talk to former ADL people about this worrying anti-Semitism stuff, that was a certain pivot in a way that was ducking this issue. And since then we've seen this, and it caused me to revisit Ryan Grimm's most recent book. I don't know if it's We Got People or The Squad. I think The Squad is the second one.
And it's We've Got People. Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
And it ends with a pretty revealing thing that I think maybe more DSA people need to read, which is that AOC looks back at her beating Crowley as, look, it was nice to have Justice Democrats and DSA and the media come along, but she ran that campaign herself. And if it wasn't for her, it wouldn't have happened. And
Mhm.
as the influence of, and as we talked about, as the sort of movement subsides, she's made clearly an opportunistic. I genuinely think like she could be looking at higher office in a way that I suspected she'd burn out before that
Mhm.
previously, but like I think she's playing a different type of game now, and it's not one that I don't think has a lot of connection to the movements, and it's it's sad to see.
No, I think that's actually a really good point to get to some of these thoughts that I've put together, Matt. And please jump in at any time, because this is something that you and I have been talking about since we've launched Left Reckoning. Is like, what is the relationship between the socialist movement to some of these elected officials, right? Trying to map it out, because it's extremely difficult. Because the ideal world is this: the ideal world is Matt, you and I are born into a world where in America there's an independent working class party, and we get to be members of that and fight for it to win elections, and fight for a better world that way. That's not the world that we've entered into. It might be our historic task to have to build something like that, which is why I find this moment to be so difficult. And we're in a difficult moment for a lot of reasons. One, I think that the left, and by that I mean like the democratic socialist left, the socialist movement in general, the working class movement, is very divided. And it's been divided since before this election. Frankly, ever since Bernie Sanders dropped out in 2020, there has been tremendous amounts of confusion as to where it should go next. A lot of that is because many of these figures, particularly people like AOC, had one foot in, one foot out with regards to this movement, which made it very difficult for it on the national stage to be able to chart out politics. Now, I don't want to get into too many weeds here, but I will just note one thing, because every time we talk about some of the problem with the national figures, you get this kind of chorus of folks being like, well, this is why we need to do local politics, right? It's like, look, we absolutely should be trying to fight and win wherever we can win. But for a movement like this to be successful, we have to be able to compete at the national stage. It's just how it works. It's why with the socialist movement in the early 20th century, you had fights to win, congressional races, mayoral races, and things like that. But what really galvanized the American working class were those Debs campaigns, were those other socialist presidential campaigns. So it can't be one or the other, and it's just
And
a
Bernie
mistake.
Sanders, frankly.
True. And it would just be a mistake if people say, "Oh, we tried under Bernie to do something and we lost, so now we're going to get very, very, very hyper local." That is a way to sort of condemn this movement into into multiple decades of marginality. But anyways, this movement is divided because it sort of did not have that guiding post going forward after Bernie dropped out. And now, not only is it divided, it's on the back foot, as we saw with Bowman, as we saw with Bush, and as we see with the more defensive ways that people who are associated with this movement are acting right now, right? And there's this kind of false narrative that is being put out there that, well, yes, the hopes of our maybe our members or members of this movement being the standard bearers didn't end up working out, but a lot of the stuff has been incorporated into the Kamala Harris campaign. I find that to be absolutely ridiculous when you see the Harris campaign coming out and reminding the American people that the vice president, quote, no longer supports a single payer healthcare system, or other kind of things like she no longer supports a federal job guarantee, to the other reporting that we've done on this program out about how Wall Street is so invested in her campaign. The idea that this is some kind of continuation of this movement, when that was a middle of the road thing, right? It's like, do you support single payer? Yes or no? You're not a part of this kind of thing. Right now, all of a sudden, that kind of fundamental plank of this movement is up to negotiation. And people used to be pretty good at seeing the difference between democratic socialist politics and this more corporate Democrat triangulation. Hell, watch the videos that you and I did, Matt, for years with Michael Brooks, on Andrew Yang, on Elizabeth Warren, and yes, even Kamala Harris, for a reminder of the kind of conversations that we were having back then. Whenever somebody would put these kind of pseudo-progressive, pseudo-left platforms out there, we recognize it's like, oh, wow, UBI, interesting idea. Oh, wait a second. What Andrew Yang is actually proposing is a way to undermine the American welfare system, right? People used to have a nose out for that kind of thing that I don't see them having as much anymore. And maybe that's because of a sense of despair. But it's a very bad moment when this movement that used to be kind of astute at recognizing these things is getting bamboozled all over again.
I also think there's a difference in a slightly more austerity-driven neoliberal era and now our antitrust neoliberal era. And now people are taking that as if like we're going after algorithmic price fixing in real estate equals like DSA is having some, or the left is having some kind of influence, when really like that's kind of just policy. Like that's policy that, I mean, you would have people like proposing that in 2003, right? Like, right. Like, and so like anything that's slightly like sensible doesn't mean it's socialist, right?
Yeah, no. And I think this is an important bit about coalitions here. And I want to get into this a little bit because maybe, I've been sort of struggling over the past few weeks, to express my frustration in a kind of a productive way, let's say. And I think this is the way to sort of do it, is to actually look to what you're noting there, right there, Matt, is like, what is the makeup of these kind of policies? Not just what is it going to do if it's put in place, but who is putting in place and for what ends. And I think maybe to get us started on the subject, there's a really great piece, and maybe we'll be able to get him back on the program. Previous Left Reckoning guest, great writer, Neil Meyer, had a really excellent piece on Left Notes called "The Politics of the Three Lefts," and we're not going to read the whole thing here, but I wanted to reference it for everybody, where he notes these three different lefts: the progressive left, which that's the Jayapals, that's the Warrens, that's the Ro Khanna. Neil also notes what these people are reading, right? We might call it labor liberalism, quoting Joe Burns. This kind of progressive movement wants a nicer version of capitalism, right? Wants more reforms, might want some of the things that we as socialists want. But at the end of the day, they want to, quoting from Neil's piece, progressive prioritize a legislative strategy and grassroots lobbying to win reforms that will soften the edges of what some on the progressive left call, quote, crony capitalism, the goal being to save capitalism from itself. And he sort of notes its relationship to the rest of, to the international scene. The Democratic left is a second left. The Democratic left is anchored in democratic open membership organizations. The DSA is the dominant force of the Democratic left. People reading things like Jacobin in these times, Labor Notes and Dissent. The horizon of the Democratic left is democratic socialism, a transition out of capitalism by way of a democratic road. It supports both electoral and workplace organizing to get there as popular street mobilizations. It is comfortable with more aggressive challenges to the Democratic Party, though some on the Democratic left are starting to embrace a popular front orientation, right? I mean, this is a very in-depth piece that I highly suggest people read.
And that's been a big shift with AOC. Like you read and you cover the coverage of her first years in Congress, and it was all like, I don't care whose toes I'm stepping on. Like she literally protested in Pelosi's office. Grimm goes into like deep detail about that. And the truth is that she's not on that posture anymore, and that's just objectively. It's not condemnation. I mean, I'm not happy about it, I'll tell you that. But it's just reality.
No, yeah. And he also notes a third left, which he calls the hard left, which is dominated by cadre organizations like PSL. Its goal is to end capitalism, but it defends the need to use authoritarian methods in the transition out of capitalism. It tends to strongly support governments in Venezuela, North Korea, and Nicaragua, among others. The hard left is totally opposed to any activity inside the Democratic Party and prefers to run independent protest candidates, but its main focus is on mass mobilization through groups like Answer Coalition that have years of experience. It shows up at all the protests, which is very, very true. And the note here is that the hard left's activist core numbers around 1,000 or so, and its supporter base must be some multiple of that. It is heavily investment in popular media could help it reach many more in the future. But anyways, the note is here. These are three different parts of what we might call the American left. And I think this is a good kind of constellation here to understand it and to work out of it. The moment that we're in, right? Because I think that all three of these camps, I agree with Neil, all three of these camps do have different visions. And there can be coalition building and solidarity on a lot of the things that we agree on to build a strong movement. But there also has to be clear lines of demarcation between these things if you want to be successful. And as somebody, who aligns myself more along the democratic socialist model for how I want to see politics won in this country, I think it is absolutely clear here that there needs to be a line drawn within the democratic socialist movement. And what we are seeing right now, very, very clearly, is the need to have a strategic reset. A very serious look at the tactics and strategies that have gotten us to this place, both to the level where we feel that we might be able to influence politics, but then also into this kind of difficult moment of realizing, man, we feel like we should be able to influence politics, but we are seeing the weakness of our movements in being able to do that. What should we do? To get there, I think we have to dispel one massive myth that all Americans believe, and even a lot of socialists and people on the left believe, that politics is like a gradient, right? The difference between a liberal and a socialist is a line, right? A socialist, to put it bluntly, like people believe things like a socialist is just a really, really, really liberal.
The most liberal guy, yeah.
Karl Marx, this massive, massive lib. Now, y'all probably know that is wrong. Why? Because liberals want this nicer version of capital, right? Be it the progressive one, or even just like, what maybe a Bill Clinton or somebody like that believed in, that if, there's more economic stability and wealth in the country, that, there'll always be some people at the bottom, but the bottom will be nicer, right? Well, socialists absolutely refuse that model. They recognize that the entirety of capitalism as a system is predicated on the exploitation of the masses, that is the working people. And we have a fundamental commitment not just to eradicate some of the rougher edges of the system, but to create a radically new, different system built upon the ideas of democracy, of freedom, and of breaking the domination of certain people by others, right? That's a fundamentally different commitment than somebody like an Obama or Nancy Pelosi has, right? So the gradient model that a lot of people consider to be, that's how politics works, is just absolutely wrong. And it's the same thing between progressives and democratic socialists. And this is what I want to get to here, Matt, is because I think a lot of people, and I think this line has become extremely blurred over the past 4 years or so. And I think it's exceptionally so over the past couple of weeks, right? If you understand that a socialist is not just a super liberal, a socialist is also not just a super progressive, right? Because a lot of people will say things, well, what's the difference between people, comrades and friends of mine who might be more progressive will say, oh, we sort of want similar things. We just have a difference of opinion in how to get there or how to achieve our goals. No, socialists want to see a fundamental rebalance of power. Not for some kind of nicer version of capitalism, a world where you still have to work to make your boss rich, but might not just be one check away from starvation, right? That's a nicer version of it. That's the progressive version of capitalism, but that's still capitalism. It's still a system that is predicated on the exploitation of American workers, on the exploitation of the global South, and of fundamental non-democracy at the workplace, right? We want working people to be in control of their own lives, to be able to enjoy the bounty that they create, not ship it off to some rich asshole. Right. And that's a fundamental political difference. That's not just a difference of how we get there. Those are fundamentally different goals. Now, again, a progressive might want a higher minimum wage like me. I'm very happy to work with them and all that. Right. I count many progressives among my friends. But this blurring of these lines between this politics can get really, really dangerous when we start thinking about how to articulate and fight for our kind of politics. Because what we're getting now, what socialists are being sort of challenged with, called to, is how we get there, right? So what we're getting if we criticize Kamala Harris and what's going on within the current Democratic National Convention, and some of the rhetorical moves that we're seeing from Democratic Party officials is, oh, you're so upset because you're getting just a little bit of what you want and not the whole thing, and now you're throwing a fit like a child, right? Just absolutely please jump in if you want to, Matt. But it's
Well, I mean, this was the beginning of my political consciousness. The same thing happened under the first Obama term. When people started criticizing Obama's economic policy, they were called emo progs. If you were like, why are you complaining about,
oh my
him
God.
doing this sort of drone policy? Or why, you have a problem with him not doing the mortgage cram down and helping Americans? Well, that's tough and it's really complicated, this economy stuff. So why don't you just cry about it? That was the attitude taken in 2009.
No, and Matt, not for us to be old guys, we're both just like in our early 30s here, but it is like a little bit of historical memory will go a long way in sort of understanding how we're not seeing something particularly new. We're seeing very much a continuation of an old argument. The difference is that our movement, the socialist movement, is larger, has more potential than it has in a very, very long time, which is why I have no interest in sort of selling it or seeing it disappear so cheaply, right? So one of the things that we have to be asking ourselves here, when we get sort of challenged by even good, well-intentioned friends and comrades on this, is to ask ourselves these kind of fundamental political questions, because not only do we have different goals than the progressives or the liberals when it comes to politics, but we have a different belief in the strategy of how to get there, right? Progressives believe in a kind of pleading dynamic with capital and with the state and with the Democratic Party, being a junior coalition partner of the Democratic Party, so that, yes, every once in a while we'll sprinkle some kind of progressive policy here and there. Socialists believe in working class independence and in working class power, and in building up the capacity of the working class to be a force on the political scene so that it has its demands met. Now, there's a lot of different ways to get there. The conversation, I think, is beyond the scope of this one today. But the fundamental conversations are still the ones that we've been having for the past few years. How can we build pre-party formation for a working class movement? How can we build a united working class movement? How can we create politicians who are connected to the movement, who are class rooted, not class focused? Matt, it's probably been a long time since I've said that on this program, right? But that's one of the fundamental distinctions. And just really quick, the distinction between being class rooted and class focused is absolutely critical. Class focused is where you do things like talk about the working class. Hell, that's something that Democrats have been doing for a really long time. They'll say, "Oh, we believe that working families should get taken care of," or whatever, right? Versus being class rooted. Being class rooted is being of the class, being the articulation of a working class kind of politics, being connected to the base, understanding exactly what the working class wants. To give a quick example of this. You could see this with a political movement like Syriza in Greece, the radical left party that came into power in Greece in 2014. That was like the big hope in 2015 was the big hope of so many of us, before Bernie and all these kind of movements. Well, you had a lot of left wingers who were very, very correct in sort of pointing to things that they'd like to see in Greek society and all of that. But when it came time to sort of facing down the European Union and the deep state and the financial class, they were unable to sort of mobilize, the working class, or prepare it in the way that would be necessary to take on that final confrontation, and ended up completely capitulating to the EU. Right? That was an example of a kind of class-focused politics and the dangers that could come out of that kind of politics. We need very clearly in this country independent working class formation, either in a party or an organization. And what we're getting right now from a lot of people on the left, or a lot of people on the progressive left, even people who might call themselves socialists, is not kind of conversation about how to build that kind of organization or that movement. It's all this kind of coalitional strategy, right? Oh, yeah, we can build this coalition, that coalition, wine moms and, labor leftists. That kind of politics is no different strategy than every goddamn political pundit in the United States of America since the beginning of the mass media. No different from Karl Rove or James Carville when you start talking about politics in that way. And socialists have to fundamentally think about politics differently. So in closing, I'll just say this. Our movement is on the back foot. The past 4 years have been extremely difficult. And what we're seeing right now is this progressive side of our movement, the lines between that democratic socialist line and that progressive side have gotten extremely blurry. And we're seeing a lot of progressives, a lot of people who had a hard time telling the difference between a Bernie Sanders and an Elizabeth Warren a few years back, wanting to re-enter into the Democratic Party mainstream. And to do that, they're going to feel the need to excise this dangerous and rowdy membership of the left, right? So they'll call, Democratic Socialists things like unserious or joy killers, right? And you could see this in the kind of cognitive dissonance right now, where so much of the talk about Kamala Harris is this mental health language. It's like, oh, I need to feel joy. I need to feel relief, all this kind of stuff. You need to find that kind of peace in your life outside of politics, friends, because there's a long fight ahead of us. Now, on the Democratic Socialist side, it's extremely difficult too, because we're going to have to navigate our way out of this. We're going to have to think differently than just not participating in politics, which is a tendency that we're going to see so many calls for the next few weeks. Right, Matt?
Because I was just going to say, like, I think there's a huge contingent of especially younger progressives who might like develop along the lines on the question of Israel-Palestine, but not in the way of like a socialist, right? Like become like, and it'll be some that as like a radicalizing moment, or whether it's this abortion stuff too. You'll develop sort of more progressive types of folks, but it won't be with that ideological bent.
No, I mean, and seriously, and this is one of the difficulties that we have when we don't have that national project. We don't have that kind of electoral project to give people the kind of sustenance that is necessary to sustaining a long-term left-wing democratic socialist movement in this country, right? So non-participation is not an option. Turning your back on the entire democratic socialist project is not an option. So we're going to have to engage with politics in a way that actually is able to build independent socialist working class power, right? Not a transactional temporary arrangement that means muting and diluting our demands for a better world, right? And that's a difficult task, right? I don't have the answers as to how to do that in this moment, right? That is something that is going to have to be constructed together. But what I would implore our friends and comrades and listeners here is to ask yourself those questions. Is what we're doing building working class independence and working class power? Or is it just engaging in transactional politics that are benefiting, in many cases, class enemies of working class people, right? And we should be very, very serious about the role that we're playing in American politics, because you don't want this movement to be regarded in a similar way to how Obama what Obama did to so many people who got engaged and involved in politics during the Obama years, right? Where they had a lot of hopes for the future, a lot of ideas that things were going to change. They became extremely disappointed and they became disengaged because of that, right? We're very close to seeing something like that potentially happening with our movement without even having the opportunity of getting our guy in power. So I hope to be along the ride with all of y'all, building, and figuring out some of the answers to these questions. But this is, I think, very much, a very, very dangerous time that we have to take very seriously.
David Marcus, a literary editor for The Nation, tweeted this. I thought it's a good little snapshot of kind of what we're talking about. Sean Fain speaking about the working class standing up in front of a campaign slogan that reads "Strong Middle Class, Strong America," tells you everything you need to know about. He says why writing history in America is hard, but exactly. And like I noticed, I want to be fair. Some people got on because AOC did use the term working class in her speech. The clip that I saw, it was her saying middle class.
She did.
Don't like that.
Yeah, I don't like it either. It's really bad. I mean, but that's become the kind of theme of the Kamala Harris campaign. Is like, working class values. That's a very different. Sorry, Jesus Christ. I don't even have it in my mental map to say that. They keep on saying middle class values, right?
Well, FT Signifier had a good thing on Kamala. It's that's going to be, it's bougie politics. Yeah, once you get like all these like dude bros for Harris and women for Harris, it's never like working women. It's never like people with a bunch of credit card debt because they've been spending on essentials. They put in diapers on it for Harris. It's always like people who can spend a lot of money to fund some campaigns for Harris.
Yeah.
But
well, folks, we're going to go over the post game patreon.com/left reckoning to get access to that. Hey, if you have any thoughts on what we were saying today, you can get those in the Discord. We'll be taking questions. Matt's got a quick visit from our good friend Russell Brand.
It ain't quick. That's
Well,
false
I don't mean
advertising. We're
actually,
gonna
you're right. I shouldn't undersell it.
I put my bib on. We're gonna dig it.
No, but folks, you'll want to come over for that and support the show and get access to our Sunday shows as well. I appreciate all of y'all so much. And yeah, come over, see us in just a couple minutes.